Welcome to Truth Watchers. I'm Heath Henning. The last 2 weeks, I've been discussing how the New Age movement is infiltrating Christianity today. I should probably rephrase that because the New Age infiltrating Christianity is not a new thing, just happening in recent days. Dozens of authors have documented this fact before I wrote my book, Crept in Unawares, which was published in 2019. Actually, I was 24 years old when I stumbled across this information and thought I discovered something new. When I continued the research, I found out Constant Cumby published The Hidden Dangers of the Rainbow back in 1983, a year before I was even born, commenting on the New Age impact in Christianity. She wrote on page 39 of that book, quote, "It is further contended, contrary to past Christian thought, that this movement has infiltrated all of Christianity, as well as Judaism, sneaking into the side door of our institutions. It has taken the form of Easternization of our churches, successfully permeating even evangelical denominations. It is blatant among Roman Catholics and mainline Protestant denominations, particularly Episcopalian and United Methodists," unquote. Such assertive claims drew negative attention from leaders of the Christian counter-cult movement, as Miss Cumby mentioned in her 1985 book with this title, A Planned Deception. On page 70, she wrote, quote, "Not all Christian cult authorities have agreed with my analysis. Dr. Walter Martin has said, 'Don't worry about it, it's only occultism,'" unquote. But by 1989, Walter Martin himself announced in the last book he published before his death, quote, "There is a danger that the New Age thought may lead some Christians astray," unquote. That is from Walter Martin's book, The New Age Cult, page 78. He also stated on page 44, quote, "It may well be that the Antichrist will be a figure like Maitreya, who will succeed in consolidating all authority and then reveal himself with all powers, signs, and lying wonders," 2 Thessalonians 2:9, "deluding the world with his evil charisma. The New Age cult fits that description, and only time will reveal the extent of its power," unquote. So before his death, Dr. Martin had changed his perspective of "don't worry, it's only the occult," to indicating the New Age Messiah figure, Lord Maitreya, may be the Antichrist prophesied about in the Bible. Dave Hunt published his book, Peace, Prosperity, and the Coming Holocaust, back in 1983, discussing the New Age, but it was in 1985 when he published Seduction of Christianity that exposed most Christians to the fact that the New Age was truly infiltrating Christianity. By the time I was saved at the age of 19, this information was all hushed up and ignored or forgotten about. And it seems Christianity today is not only ignorant of the fact it has been infiltrated by the New Age, but often churches seem to enjoy the fact they are immersed in the New Age movement. In 1980, the book The Aquarian Conspiracy by Marilyn Ferguson bragged about how extensive her Aquarian conspirators had permeated society. And by 1984, New Ager John Randolph Price boasted of the fact that, quote, "New thought concepts are spreading more rapidly than any other spiritual teaching," unquote. That is from his book, The Planetary Commission, page 32. In 1987, Tex Mars reported in the preface of his book, The Dark Secrets of the New Age, quote, "The New Age religion has already become the fastest growing religious movement on earth," unquote. The following year, 1988, Dave Hunt and Tom McMahon stated in their book, The New Spirituality, page 18, quote, "While skeptical observers over the past 20 years have persisted in labeling it a fad and predicting its imminent passing, the New Age movement has quietly but relentlessly gathered momentum," unquote. In 1990, Norman Geisler again affirmed that the New Age was the, quote, "fastest growing alternate belief system in the country, unquote. That is from his book, Apologetics in the New Age, page 9. And in 1992, Peter Jones wrote in his book, The Gnostic Empire Strikes Back, page 3, quote, "It would be a monumental error to think that the New Age is just another passing fad of West Coast spiritual exotica," unquote. Barit Kujos, in her book, How to Protect Your Children from the New Age and Spiritual Deception, recollected attending a Christian writers conference in the early 90s, quote, where several publishing house editors had concluded that the New Age movement had peaked, no need for more books on the topic, they said, for the faddish seductions of the beautiful side of evil would soon fade away, unquote. This assessment from Christian publishing companies was so far from the truth, Christianity turned a blind eye to the fact, and by the time I was saved, churches were devastated by the extent of the New Age infiltration. I should add a bit of my testimony here. I was an atheist and a drug dealer when I was younger. My oldest brother was sentenced to 10 years for 3 accounts of armed burglaries. When he got out of prison, he mentioned a book I should read, which was on biblical apologetics. I read that book and was convinced that God did exist and he had revealed himself through the Bible. So I started reading the Bible beginning in Genesis. I read through the Bible, and when I got to Romans chapter 3, I finally understood the gospel and was born again. After that, I began visiting churches every Sunday morning. I continued reading the Bible and had already read most of it, but when I visited different churches, I knew right away what was being preached was not what the Bible was teaching. I visited close to 70 different churches before I found one that preached the Bible. It took a year and a half of visiting different churches until I found one church that preached the Bible in my area. This would have been around 2004 or 2005, somewhere around then, when I discovered a Bible preaching church. So former New Ager Warren Smith criticized the trends of churches in his book, A Wonderful Deception, page 11, stating, quote, by the mid-1990s, the church was led to believe that the New Age had peaked and was no longer a serious threat. In reality, New Age teachings were spreading exponentially in almost every conceivable way, unquote. While most Christian publishers were ignoring the New Age in the 1990s, Ron Rhodes wrote in 1997, quote, the New Age movement has been called the fastest growing alternative belief system in the country, unquote. David Cloud wrote in his 2008 book titled The New Age Tower of Babel, page 31, quote, yet the New Age keeps growing, and the reason is that it is one aspect of the mystery of iniquity that is prophesied in scriptures, unquote. And Brandon House in 2009 had to quote a secular source to provide warning of the New Age movement's continual growth, stating in his book Grave Influence, page 52, quote, the Denver Post in June 2008 reported that pagan spirituality is doubling in America every 18 months, unquote. And here we are in the year 2025, and the New Age has continued to grow in influence in our society and in churches. And that is all just an introduction of what I wanted to talk about today. The big question to ask is how? How could churches become so infiltrated by the New Age? How could they let this happen? Theologically speaking, there are 2 elements that play into this topic. First is our sin nature, and more specifically, the noetic sin nature, that is, how our minds are affected by the sin nature. The noetic effect of the sin nature not only allows us to be deceived, but also makes us desire deception over truth and to be self-deluded. We literally are predisposed to self-deception. The second element is, of course, Satan and his conspiracy behind the corruption of the churches to disarm them and destroy them. That is what have been discussing in the last few weeks now, and what my book Crept In Unawares is all about. However, we need to delve into the question more historically and philosophically. How did Christianity become integrated with the New Age movement? This question brings us back to an 18th century philosopher named George Hegel, who produced the modern dialectic philosophy. Helena Blavatsky, who is responsible for birthing the modern New Age movement, referred to, quote, the great metaphysician Hegel, unquote, in her first volume of The Secret Doctrines, page 257. And on page 641, she says the, quote, fine philosophical remarks of Hegel are found to have their application in the teaching of occult science, unquote. John Burbage, in the introduction to the book Hegel in His Time, indicated the writing of the occult philosophy, quote, came at a time when Hegel was frequenting the company of known Masons, some of them graduates of the band Illuminati, unquote. I explained how Adam Weishaupt and the Bavarian Illuminati infiltrated the Masons in my video from last week titled The Secret Agenda of Freemasonry. If you want more on that and haven't seen that video, check it out. What exactly was Hegel's philosophy that is impacting society and churches to accept a New Age spirituality? Glenn Alexander McGee wrote in his book Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition, page 154 through 155, quote, the necessity of Hegel's dialectic transition is displayed in their triadic structure. It is frequently pointed out that this structure is often inadequately portrayed as the process of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The triad structure of dialectic may be described as follows. First, there is an initial idea, which when thoroughly thought through suggests its opposite, or at least an opposing or contradictory idea. A third term then appears that reconciles these two. This reconciliation is accomplished in various ways, but frequently it involves a discovery of an underlying of commonality between the two terms initially thought to be different, unquote. Hegel himself never used the formula thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but rather cites his own as abstract negative concrete or immediate mediated concrete. Hegel's formula presents a faculty of an abstract, that is, incomplete or immature, an unformed object or thought presented with its negative, that is, the errors or inconsistencies will cause its purged and purified form, that is, the concrete, meaning solid, impenetrable, and immovable. The modern expression thesis, antithesis, synthesis, presented by Immanuel Kant, bears the idea that the thesis, that could represent the truth, presented with its antithesis, that is the opposite of the truth, in this case a lie, can be merged together and form a synthesis, a compromise synchronizing of the truth with error. This synthesis is viewed as a higher form of truth, which then becomes a new thesis and can follow endlessly in the cycles of antithesis and synthesis as an evolving truth, always getting greater. This would indicate there really is no truth outside of this philosophy of an evolving truth. Now, obviously, this philosophy is the exact opposite with what the Bible teaches. But according to the philosophy, you need to start with a thesis, which would be the truth of the Bible, and merge it with the opposite, such as this philosophy, which says there is no truth, but only an evolving process to get to a greater certainty. In 1 John 2:21, we read, no lie is of the truth. However, this philosophy would say we need to blend the lie with the truth to reach a greater truth. David Cloud, in his book, The New Age Tower of Babel, page 44, stated, quote, for the Bible believer, the Bible is the infallible thesis, and every antithesis is to be rejected and no synthesis allowed, unquote. And John Getch wrote in his book, Contemporary Compromise, page 17, quote, God is not looking for blenders, but rather defenders of his inspired, inerrant, infallible, and preserved word, unquote. It was this concept, which was embedded in the philosophy of the mystery religions for centuries before Hegel expounded the concept with his philosophy, that produced Gnosticism. Hegel was affiliated with the Freemasons and Rosicrucianism, and other Hermetic secret societies. He developed their views into philosophical language to reveal to the world at large what has been the ideology of these Gnostic cults all along. I explained this in my video a few weeks ago titled Neo-Gnosticism, the New Age Infiltrating Christianity. Gnosticism was a parasite religion leeching on to other existing religions. They adapted the terminologies of other religions, but defined the terms to fit their philosophical and theological views. That is how they infiltrated churches. Nicola Denzi Lewis wrote the only current existing college-level textbook on Gnosticism for Oxford from a neo-Gnostic sympathetic perspective. The title is Introduction to Gnosticism, published in 2013. On page 46, she writes, quote, "People who have been labeled Gnostic were often really best characterized not as Gnostic at all, but as pro-assimilationists, as being experimental about blending Christianity and Roman traditions," unquote. On page 133, she describes Gnosticism as, quote, "Greek philosophy, Egyptian, Christian, and Jewish ideas, figures from Greek mythology, and bits of magical tradition, all mixed together, evidently coming from a fairly eclectic social environment," unquote. And on page 246 through 247, she said, quote, "Platonism was a dominant philosophical school of the Roman Empire and had the greatest impact on what some scholars call Gnosticism. Modern scholars have long recognized this relationship between Gnosticism and Platonism," unquote. In fact, if you look at the footnotes of any copy of the Nag Hammadi scriptures, you see frequently references to Plato in the Gnostic scriptures. New evangelicalism is a modern form of Gnosticism and is essentially the view that will lead to the one world apostate church of the Antichrist. For those not acquainted with recent history of Christianity, I'll give a very brief overview of the last few hundred years. When the Enlightenment movement arose, people began to question parts of the Bible. This gave rise to Unitarianism and liberal theology. Liberalism, also referred to as modernism, was never Christianity, as it denied the essential truths of the Bible in an attempt to make Christianity a mere moral conduct to dictate social outreach. In 1923, John Grisham Machen wrote the book Christianity and Liberalism, in which he argued liberalism was an entirely different religion from Christianity. Fundamentalism was the bastion of truth in those days, upholding the doctrines of the Bible and defending against the attacks from liberalism. Fundamentalists used to go by the synonymous term evangelical, but in 1948, the term neo-evangelical was dubbed by Harold Ockenga. Ockenga wrote the foreword for Harold Lindsell's book Battle for the Bible in 1976, stating, quote, "Neo-evangelicalism differed from modernism in its acceptance of the supernatural and its emphasis on the fundamental doctrines of scriptures. It differed from fundamentalism in its repudiation of separation and its determination to engage itself in the theological dialogue of the day. It had a new emphasis upon the application of the gospel to the sociological, political, and economic areas of life," unquote. In other words, neo or new evangelicalism refused to separate, but rather were willing to dialogue with the liberal theologians. What this dialogue produced was a synthesis, a blending of the thesis of the biblical truth and the antithesis of liberal skeptics. Ockenga further stated in the foreword of Lindsell's book, quote, "New evangelicals emphasized the restatement of Christian theology in accordance with the need of the times, the re-engagement in the theological debate, the recapturing of denominational leadership, and the re-examination of theological problems such as the antiquity of man, the universality of the flood, God's method of creation, and others," unquote. He said, They, quote, emphasize the restatement of Christian theology in accordance with the needs of the times, unquote, as if the Bible and theology needs to be updated because as time evolves, so does the truth. This is Hegel's philosophy. This is Gnosticism in our day. Now, when Okenge was writing this in the foreword of Linzel's book, The Battle for the Bible, the concept of Linzel's book was that by 1976, the younger generation of new evangelicalism has disregarded the Bible and all the essential doctrines that make Christianity unique. Well, no duh. Of course, that will happen in the following generation. If you crack the door open for a little compromise, the very next generation will always swing that door wide open. So that was the lament of the new evangelical leaders in the 1970s, and here we are 50 years later. And it has only gotten worse. This information has been repeated over and over again in multitudes of publications, but it seems to fall upon deaf ears. One of the recent books published on the topic after my book is this one, The New Age Trojan Horse, What Christians Should Know About Yoga and the Enneagram by Dr. Chris Berg. I'm planning to have him on the show in a few weeks to discuss this topic further. I'm looking forward to that. And until then, this is Heath Henning. Thank you for tuning into Truth Watchers podcast. Remember to hit the subscribe button and share it with a friend. For more fascinating facts, check us out at truthwatchers.com, because sound apologetics and exegesis of scriptures is important for all of God's children, as is indicated in 3 John verse 4. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth.